Hello, everyone, and happy Earth Day. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Mohammed Mahmoud. I'm the director of the Climate and Water Program at the Middle East Institute. And welcome today especially because really you're joining us at the beginning of our new event series that we are hosting at MEI by the Climate and Water Program, which is called Innovations in Climate Resilience. What we're doing with this series is basically showcasing different practical applications that address a particular aspect of climate change vulnerability in the region and illustrates ways on how to adapt or mitigate against it. Just a little bit of housekeeping in terms of how we're going to operate the webinar today. The format basically will begin after these introductions with a short presentation by our guest speaker, who I'll introduce momentarily, followed by a Q&A discussion. So for those of you attending live virtually, I encourage you to submit your questions through the Q&A chat window that's enabled through Zoom as the presentation moves along. And I'll make sure that we address your questions when we get to the Q&A session after the light presentation by our guest speaker. So today's topic regarding innovations in climate resilience is on restoring the world's mangrove forests. And our guest speaker is Vahid Fathi, and he's the founder and CEO of Blue Forest. He is a leading UAE project developer that is focused on restoration of mangrove forests. A little bit more about Vahid. He was previously the vice president for Middle East and Africa of Source Global, which is a solar powered water technology company that has been backed by Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. His nature-based infrastructure experience really stems from his role as managing director of Access Power, which was a developer of clean energy assets. And while with Access Power, he originated, developed, and helped secure financing for solar and wind power projects in 12 countries, delivering over $600 million worth of clean energy projects to millions of people. So welcome, Vahid. Thank you for joining us today. And with that very short and quick introduction, I will hand it over to Vahid to share with us a very short and lively presentation on our topic today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mohammed, for inviting me to this webinar and to this series. Delighted to be working with the Middle East Institute and support the great work that you were doing, and particularly to talk about the work that I'm doing with regards to restoring coastlines and mangroves and why that's important. I will share with you some slides that I've prepared for today's event. And let me know if you want to this way, or should I use the slideshow format?
Slideshow probably will bring it out nicely.
All right. So I want to first start off by pointing out like just one number, which I think really frames our discussion very well, and that's this one. Think of Greece. When we think of Greece, we think of the beautiful rolling hills, the teal blue, the pristine white coastline. But another way of looking at Greece is the fact that every year we lose forests that's equivalent to the size of Greece. So think of a forest the size of Greece being wiped out every year, year after year. That's about 13 million hectares of forest that is lost, and it's accelerating. And given that the forests are really considered as the lungs of the earth, we're really, choking ourselves by destroying all these forests. And for me as a person and as really a citizen of the world, I feel that this is not right, and that we should do something about this. And another quote that I think really frames the discussion is this one, which is by Chief, which basically says we have to protect the forest not just for ourselves, but for our children, our grandchildren, and children yet to be born. Effectively, for future generations that are going to inhabit this beautiful planet of ours. And not only the people and the children, but also the animals, the birds, the fish, and entire ecosystems. And really, we have a duty, and I think the fact that we're doing this on Earth Day really is fitting, because it is a very important responsibility. We all have to take it seriously, and I certainly take it very seriously. And this picture here, and I should say that practically every picture in this presentation are pictures taken by myself, typically with my iPhone, from the field. And this is a picture from a reforestation project that we did in Tudor Creek in Kenya with the Brain Youth Group. This is a lovely member of the community. Her name is Margaret. She joined us. It was a Friday morning, and she brought her baby. And you see in her hands a series of mangrove propagules. And these are indigenous propagules that eventually will be planted and will become trees. And I think it's fitting that she has her child behind her and the trees in her hand, which I think really is something that we should all think about, where the responsibility of our children is on one shoulder, but we should really be thinking about our trees just as importantly, because without one, the other one is really in a bad shape. Just to start about Blue Forest. Blue Forest is a relatively a new company, but we have grown rapidly because of our specialization. We focus purely on mangroves and healing mangrove forests. So think of us as mangrove doctors. We really understand the mangrove trees. We know how to heal them. We know how to plant them. We know where to plant them. And we have the science and the technology to do it really well. And so because of this specialization, we've kind of grown rapidly to participate in many projects in many countries. And we do the way that really differentiates us is our adoption of technology. We have brought in partners to really and databases to really deepen our know-how and our knowledge of historical satellite imagery, to map out evolutions of mangrove forests, and then to adopt LiDAR technology, which is paired with drone image capturing, to really map forests in a way that's never been done before, to really generate 3D imagery to show the hotspots, the areas that need healing, and then to be able to map projects based on really detailed site mapping and AI algorithms to perfect and to really polish our planting methodology, which in turn allows us to have high success rates and high survival rates amongst the mangroves that we do plant. We've been busy. Luckily, we've been fortunate to develop a number of mangrove reforestation projects in about, I would say, almost 10 countries now. And we started in the UAE, where we are based, and then we've grown rapidly to do projects around the world, particularly in tropical countries, coastal countries, mainly in the Western Indian Ocean, such as Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, but also Western Africa, such as Angola, Gabon, Ivory Coast. And recently we've expanded into Asia, where we're looking at Myanmar, which has been ravaged by deforestation, and Indonesia, which is home to the world's largest resources on mangroves. And we couldn't be happier. Honestly, we couldn't be happier. It's phenomenal work. It really gets us out of the office into the coastal areas on beautiful coastlines, working with amazing communities, and doing really meaningful work. And love it. Truly love it. And I think the team really enjoys the work. Now, why are we focusing on mangroves, and what are mangroves? Initially, I didn't even think mangroves were trees before I actually entered this world. But surely enough, mangroves are trees, and they're not just any tree. They're kind of like the super tree, because they're the only tree that can grow in salty, oxygen-poor areas where half the time it's dry and half the time it's submerged in water. I mean, just think of the amount of complexity the tree needs to have to be able to adapt to dry land, to moist land, to wet land, and it does it super well. And the tree now prevails in 118 countries, mostly around the equator, and there's over 50 species of them around the world, including here in the Gulf region. Of all the trees in the world, the mangroves represent only 3%. Only 3% of all the world's forests are mangrove forests. So tiny, yet they have incredible powers, and they really, punch way above their belt. And here's why. For one, they are amazing protection against tidal waves and imbalances in kind of ocean-based events such as tsunamis and cyclones. I mean, if you remember the 2004 tsunami that hit Asia, there is now significant research done to demonstrate that those communities that had rich mangrove forests did really well, whereas those who didn't suffered a lot. And we have to remember that there's about 15 million people who could see their homes disappear if not for mangroves. And so it really is a shield, and is often referred to as the guardian of the coast because of its protection. Now, in the Gulf, it's less of an issue because the seas are relatively kind of calm. But certainly around the world, and particularly in Asia, this is a big factor. And another one is an ability to serve as a nursery, as a nesting ground for fish to lay their eggs. And you'd be surprised the marine life that kind of blossoms. It's an entire party down there. And there's many different species of fish, crabs, and other kind of shellfish that thrive nestled underneath branches of these mangroves. Beyond the fishes, of course, you have flora and fauna that do well. There's hundreds of species of birds that kind of live there. And in fact, if you're here in the UAE and you go to Ajman, you can see beautiful flamingos kind of chilling near the mangrove forest of Ajman. And so it's definitely a beautiful area to witness and to appreciate fauna and flora if you go into these mangrove forests. And another less well known is that they're also very accommodating for bees, particularly in the Arabian Gulf. There you see a lot of bee harvesting or honey harvesting in mangrove forests, which is great. And perhaps the kind of the most relevant one, and particularly one in terms of climate change, is their carbon sequestration abilities. Now, they're known as the kings of carbon, and there's a reason for that. Is because they sequester more CO2 than rainforests. And they do this because they are able to retain carbon in both the above ground biomass, which is the trunk and the branches, as well as the below ground biomass, which is the roots, and in the soil organic content that is within the ground. And so if you add all these up, they become like an amazing bank, sequestering 5 to 10 times more than terrestrial forests. And one other great part is that typically, depending on the species and the environment, they're about 25% less expensive to plant and to restore. And so really, if you're looking at the carbon sequestration game, this is where you want to put your money behind, because they do great work. One interesting fact is that if you take just one little mangrove forest in Micronesia, that forest can sequester as much carbon annually as an entire tropical rainforest in Panama. And just to put it in perspective, so if you had to restore a rainforest in Panama, and or restore a small mangrove forest in Micronesia, most people would think the Panama rainforest would be a better option, but in fact, the mangrove wins every time. And which is why, really, we invest so much into it, particularly because despite all these superpowers, shockingly, the mangrove forests of the world are suffering. They're really under a lot of pressure. Just to kind of make it visual, these are all, again, pictures I've taken. This is one of our project sites. And it's a big rainforest, a big mangrove forest, and it's shocking how it's being ravaged by different type of kind of pressures. You have people cutting the trees to make charcoal. You have people on the bottom cutting the trees for construction material, and then you've got people like just slashing entire hectares of it to make salt ponds. And you can see here on the right, like how it was clearly a mangrove forest, and now it's been kind of, you know, fractioned off and made into kind of a commercial business. It's really, really unfortunate because of all the benefits that we've just outlined. These are things that are happening, and you know what? It's not a judgment. It's just a reality that population's growing. Right? We all know that the world's population is growing. We're getting bigger. More and more people are showing up everywhere, and everyone needs to eat. Right? We all need to eat. Right? And look, when there's no jobs, you got to look around. And if there's a forest and you can cut the tree and make money, you cut the tree. Right? Like it's just a reality. You would do it. I would do it. Right? And so this is a reality of our world, that with rising urbanization, rising populations, someone's gonna get hurt. And right now, that thing is the mangrove forests. Mangrove forests are actually being slashed 4 times higher rate than terrestrial forests. And things for logging that we talked about, agriculture, you have things like pollution. It's just not a pretty sight. It's really not a pretty sight. I've seen it in many, many different countries. It's blatantly obvious, and it hurts. It really hurts. And us, as Blue Forest, we're taking actions. We're taking actions to kind of turn the tide. Luckily, we're not the only ones. You know, there is more and more hope. There's more interest, right? At the top, you see staff members from Deloitte. We've had hundreds of Deloitte staff members. We've also had support from SAP. We've had support from Speedo, from Amazon. Many corporates are like, hey, let's get in there. Let's kind of restore our forests, because now people are realizing the superpowers of these trees, and they want to help out. The other, even at the government level, the picture below is a partnership between the UAE Ministry of Interior in Akhtar and the local NGO in Kenya called the Brain Youth Group, where as a partnership we planted 50,000 mangroves in the UAE and another 50,000 with the NGO in Kenya, and we're going to scale it up and do 1 million trees in Kenya, which is a fantastic kind of expansion. And it really underscores the fact that people are realizing this and let's do something about it. Let's fix this, which is great. In the UAE, where Blue Forest is headquartered, it's great because, as with most things, the UAE takes a leading role. They're like, you know what, we're not going to take a back seat. We're going to lead this, and we're going to win. And so they're doing a winning job. Honestly, the UAE Ministry of Climate Change has already made plans to plant 100 million mangroves in this country, which is remarkable because right now the population is about 20 million mangroves, so it's a 5x expansion, and to bring back the forests that were there and to expand the ones that exist, both in Abu Dhabi and also in the Northern Emirates. And as with most things, they have a methodical plan to do it, very professionally, very scientifically. And not only here, but also around the world, they have made, pledged $19 billion serious money to help protect, kind of fragile environments and restore degraded lands around the world. So we will see, the UAE play a dominant role, particularly as COP28 approaches, which will be hosted here in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE in Abu Dhabi, in 2 years after the COP27 in Egypt later this year in November. And so you will see the country doing a lot of kind of restoration work and more initiatives like the one that the Ministry of Interior has done in Kenya. You'll see those blossom in many different countries and many regions, which is great. Never to be, kind of outdone, you have Saudi Arabia. And in typical fashion, they take it to the next level. What can I say? They're like, we'll see your 100 million, and we're gonna raise it to 10 billion. And like these are serious numbers here. These are serious numbers. I mean, you're gonna have to restore like the equivalent of 50,000 football pitches worth of mangroves to hit that target, which is not insignificant, which is really not insignificant. But they have the coastline. They've got the largest coastline in the entire Middle East, and the brains and the know-how to do it. And so I'm sure that the Saudi Green Initiative, which underscores this plan, will come to life, and you will see this know-how be kind of transferred across the Middle East, which is fantastic, because really there is both the potential and the need to restore the coastlines in many of the countries. Other Middle East initiatives related to mangroves can be found in Oman, which is kind of always taking a leading role in terms of environmental restoration and valuing its environment. I think that's one of the strengths. Bahrain, which is, although small, does have a very significant mangrove forests. Qatar as well. Egypt, which, as I mentioned, particularly in Sharm el-Sheikh and around that area, there is significant mangrove resources that require restoration, and the government has taken measures to restore them. Israel and Iran as well are adopting their own initiatives. So across the Middle East, you're seeing material investments, particularly in the Saudi Arabia and UAE, which is fantastic and will help not only restore the mangrove forests over there, but really to make them stronger than ever and help them sequester a lot of pollution, a lot of CO2, which for me is really heartwarming to see. Now, I know this may not have answered all of your questions, but really the key was to kind of give you a global perspective and a kind of a regional perspective about why mangroves matter and what's being done to kind of protect them and to mitigate the challenges that they're facing. And here's a number of reports that you could read. The South Pole one was quite good because it talks about the voluntary carbon markets, which is really a critical kind of piece of the equation, particularly in emerging markets, because in countries like like Gabon or in Mozambique or let's say kind of Tanzania, they have really important and strategically crucial mangrove forests, but the financing and the funding needed to restore the forests is not always there. And the beauty of the carbon markets is that it creates incentives for the polluters to, other than reducing their CO2 emissions, which is always the number one action and is always the first solution, it helps them to kind of overcome the technological limitations of offsetting their entire emissions by helping them offset the emissions by funding important projects in emerging markets to provide funds to communities that otherwise wouldn't have these funds, so that they're given an alternative to looking to the forest for livelihood. They would be able to have funding made available to not only plant trees and protect the forests, but also look at alternative livelihoods, such as different businesses that could be generated that are sustainable and that are in harmony with the forest, that not only gives them a healthy livelihood, but sustains a healthy forest as well. And so the voluntary carbon market are, I think, a very, very important solution. It's also probably the reason why you've seen a surge in demand and an associated surge in pricing for voluntary carbon credits. And I think this will play a crucial role in financing both mangrove and terrestrial forest restoration projects around the world. And we certainly, as Blue Forest, used the voluntary carbon markets to finance and structure a lot of our projects around the world. And one of the things that really we are proud of is the fact that 80% of all the proceeds that we generate from the market credits is channeled back into the country, because ultimately we think that the communities are the custodians of these forests, and they therefore have to be able to benefit the most from the benefits, because that's the only way you sustain and you kind of ensure that the forest will be protected over the long term, and is a core part of how we implement our reforestation projects. Now, I just want to end with this picture that I took. This is in Kalifi Creek, a community that lives along the mangrove forest. This is a little girl that I saw kind of sitting there. Her parents were fishermen, and they were just kind of leaving the little wooden canoe, and she was just looking at them, and she was just sitting on this beautiful mangrove tree that's just incredible. And for me, what really stood out was the fact that this is what it's all about. This is about creating harmony between communities, particularly in emerging markets, and the mangrove ecosystem that exists. And only when we've created this harmony can we ensure that the future of communities like hers will thrive. And this is certainly something that Blue Forest is working hard on, and certainly something that we would always welcome help with. So join our movement. Here's my email and our website. And I just want to thank my team. I want to thank the Middle East Institute, and also Nora Qasim, who graciously helped me with the slides and the presentation. And that's it. I'll be happy to take any questions you have, Mohammed.
Vahid, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and you've shared, I think, the best of pictures that deliver really, the point. And this topic couldn't be more on the nose for Earth Day, which I really, really appreciate. I had a lot of questions to begin. You've answered some of them, but you may have seen me scribbling, noting other questions that have come up to mind. At the same time, I encourage our audience to submit questions. I see some have already started to trickle in, so we'll absolutely get to those. And honestly, some of the questions I'll ask, you kind of touched on here and there, but I feel the need to ask them again because I want you to be able to highlight why this particular application, and you said it, but why this particular application is so useful and effective. And the first one, which you did answer, but I really wanted to come out again, which is, why, in terms when we think of reforestation, why mangrove trees versus other types of vegetation or plants that, at face value appear, and you gave that great example of the comparison with Panama, but face value, if you think of, what a reforestation effort is, just to increase, natural vegetation and the carbon sink aspect and so forth. But why mangroves? Why did you think of mangroves and decide that this is the way to move forward?
Good question. So, look, I guess for me, I've always been like a sustainability guy. My background is I used to work in oil. Don't hold that against me. But I saw the light. And I shifted to renewables. Shortly after my eldest son Cyrus was born, I'm like, how am I going to explain to my son that I'm part of the problem here? He's not going to be happy. His dad's not going to be cool, and I wanted to be a cool dad. So I shifted to solar and helped expand solar in the Middle East, which was great. And now solar is definitely an established market, and it's doing its part. But I also grew up in Canada, and in Canada you're always surrounded by trees and forestry, and I just felt a sense of zen and comfort when I was around trees. And the equivalent, the closest thing you're going to get that here in the Middle East, and particularly in the UAE, is mangroves, because mangroves are indigenous to the UAE and indigenous to much of the Gulf and the Middle East. And so I developed an affinity for mangroves and protecting them, kind of like looking after them. And surely enough, I'm like, holy shit, these trees are incredible. Like, I did research, I read up on them, I spoke to the scientists. They're like, yeah, believe it or not, these are better than rainforests. And really, fundamentally, what it comes down to is that what you see is the top end, and that's that its ability to sequester the carbon from above ground biomass is somewhat higher than the terrestrial tree, but it's really the party's underground. Like, that's what you don't see. It's what's happening in the soil, and the soil is super rich in carbon, in mangrove forests because of the fact that it sits in salt water, and it is able to kind of have the perfect configuration to bank it and to not let the CO2 be emitted. And so because of the fact that it sits in salt water and in tidal water, and it's the only tree that is able to do this, is this feature that really differentiates it from terrestrial trees and makes it able to store up to 5 to 10 times as much CO2 as typical trees you would find in Canada or Washington or anywhere else.
Yeah, I think the piece of information you shared about the comparison to rainforest may have blown people's minds. It surely, because that's the assumption, right? It's always been when we think about reforestation efforts, it's all about the rainforest, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's still a honorable thing and effort to pursue. But the fact that comparison, I don't think people would have even considered or thought about that. So that to me was very, very eye-opening.
Yeah, and look, that's it was a eureka moment for myself, and this is sharing the word, and showing the light to everyone is part of what we do, and just so that people realize, yeah, as you said, rainforests are very important, but hey, even more important are the mangrove forests, and as I mentioned, they're getting destroyed at a speed of 4 times faster. Why? Because they're typically on the coastline, and there's 2.5 billion people around the world that live along the coastline, right? And so surely enough, it's like man shows up, forest is there, man kills forest. Typical storyline, right? And so forests are getting, falling at the mercy of urban expansion. And I think now that people are realizing that, the biodiversity and the importance of the mangrove forest, slowly, protection schemes are being put in place so as to create harmony between the communities and the forests.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that because it's a question I had also that popped in my mind when you were talking about sort of the current prevalence of mangrove forests around the world, and only 3%, which mind-blowing. 3% of the world forest vegetation is mangroves. And I guess if you could offer your perspective, and it could be a combination of these things, I don't know, which is, why is that? Is that primarily because of, as you mentioned, let's say, non-natural reasons in terms of logging or urban expansion into these areas? Or is a part of it also a natural phenomenon that may be driven by natural causes, as we're seeing with impacts of climate change affecting vegetation worldwide? Like, why is it just natural biodiversity, or are there other reasons why it's such a small percentage of the world's vegetation, considering how much of the world is surrounded by coastal, it's a coastal line, essentially?
Yes. Well, that's a good question. And look, mangroves do exist in 118 countries around the world. Right? But I mean, there's not huge amounts of them because you really need the right ecological balance between freshwater and saltwater and tidal conditions. And these 3 elements, they don't exist everywhere. Certainly you can find them in northern countries or kind of the southern hemisphere. They're really along the equator. And as such, it's primarily driven by natural factors, why it's kind of a small subset of the world's total forest database. Now, that said, we have lost roughly half of all of our mangroves that have existed. So whatever we have today, which is about 14 million hectares, this is only half of what there used to be. And so we've got a lot of work to do to restore the other half that's been lost and to kind of bring those forests back. And this is certainly what we're trying to do. There's potential to plant 14 million hectares. Our ambition is to at least to 1 million hectares towards that. And there's definitely a lot of room for improvement, which is really, we see that as an opportunity.
Perfect. I will get to the Q&A questions, but this is the advantage of moderating. I can squeeze mine in first. You touched on this as well, and you've you've primarily currently have a lot of projects in Africa, looking towards Western Asia, and then you mentioned obviously the UAE where you're based. What makes and kind of hinted on this, but once again, I like to underline the key things you say. But why is the MENA region, in your opinion, a good target region for mangrove reforestation?
Okay, well, I think that the opportunity certainly exists here because the mangrove forests are prevalent in many of the countries. There's over a dozen countries across the Middle East and North Africa where you could find mangroves, and so and most of them have experienced degradation and loss. And so there's an opportunity to help fight climate change by restoring the forests that have been lost and to planting indigenous mangroves to both bring back the biodiversity and also to help fight climate change. And you see this being done right now. You see massive, massive campaigns being launched, as I mentioned, notably in Saudi Arabia, with the Saudi Green Initiatives, SGI, which is, I think people don't realize just how massive it is. And I think as time progresses, you will see some major steps being taken in the kingdom to really demonstrate its ability to implement the large-scale mangrove restoration. And also here in the UAE, where they're going to be planting, as I mentioned, 100 million mangroves over 3 phases across several emirates in a very methodical and scientific way. So the opportunities here, the budgets are also here, and the willingness of the governments is there. And so I think this is a fantastic environment to kind of give birth to these restoration and to kind of turn the tide on the global mangrove loss that we're seeing.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to shift to audience questions because they're coming in fast and furious, and been hogging too much of my own. So one of the first questions here, and I think it really relates to your first graphic on this idea that I think you said 13 million hectares, equivalent of Greece, forests lost annually. I think the question touches on, without sort of reforestation efforts and considering current impact of climate change on the world and global warming, et cetera, and coastal impacts around the different regions or countries where mangroves exist, without reforestation, how long would it take for these types of forests to naturally grow back or revegetate, absent any other artificial impacts of, say, logging or urban encroachment?
Good question. Yeah. So look, nature usually has a solution. Like if you cut yourself, you'll heal, right? And if you don't mess with nature, nature will figure itself out. The reality, unfortunately, is that look, climate change is everywhere. Like the water is getting saltier, right? Like the largest mangrove forest, Silverband forest in Bangladesh, right? 1 million hectares in one forest. I mean, that's huge, right? Like, it's solid. It's got the scale to overcome anything. Yet what we see is sedimentation, right? Sedimentation is it's like sandpaper, just like rubbing away at the trees, and the rising sea temperatures is also like eating away at the roots. And so the reality is that humans are really messing up the world's ability to heal itself, and really compromising its ability to kind of restore its wounds. And therefore it would take 50 to 100 years if nothing was done. Whereas if we were to take steps and to identify what species were there and to replant the species, we could accelerate the recovery and the carbon capture, which will only help reduce or certainly curb the rising sea levels and the temperatures, which I think benefits both humans and the planet.
Yeah. Another question here, a specific question on some of the example projects you have coming up. You talked about other areas of the Middle East. This one, I guess, specifically talking about the Saudi effort, and it mentions the 10 billion mangrove goal. the question is that purely reforestation, or is part of it also new forestation, as in not just rehabilitation, but actually bringing in completely new, expanding essentially?
Yeah. The term is called Aforestation,
Correct.
and indeed, yes, certainly there was no 10 billion trees did not exist there. Let's be honest. So there was a degree of afforestation, and luckily, with KAUST, they have some phenomenal scientists who really are mangrove experts, and will be able to put in place really sound policies and programs that will see the introduction of these trees in a way that's kind of sustainable, and will ensure that the survival rates will be high.
Perfect. So there's a couple of questions centered on other areas of the world that are not Middle East, or some of the areas you mentioned, and just, I guess, questions on viability and whether at some point Blue Forest will expand there. So I'll just mention the two main places that have come through in the chat. So I'm kind of combining a couple of questions here. One is in Ecuador, which has a very lush vegetative environment. Parts of it do. And then the other is, have you seen much work in the US side, particularly looking at Florida in terms of mangrove protection and reforestation?
Yeah. Look, Florida definitely has some very significant mangrove forests, particularly along the Keys. And I think that the government and the state's doing a decent job to kind of avoid massive deforestation. Ecuador, not a huge, it's not in the top 20 mangrove states in the world, because it's relatively smaller portions. What we try to do is look at where the damage is the worst, and where the opportunity is the most more urgent, and we try to work there. For example, Mozambique has the largest mangrove stretch in all of East Africa, and the second largest in all of Africa. And what we're doing is we're restoring an area the size of Luxembourg. That's all mangroves, and that will involve planting millions of mangroves, and also avoiding the destructions of even more millions of mangroves. And so it's all as much driven by livelihood measures as it is through kind of tree planting measures. And I think this is the important thing, is that it's not just about the tree, it's about the community that lives around that tree, right? You got to fix the community, and the tree will sort itself out. The encroachment of humans onto these forests is the big issue. And what we try to do is finance the projects through carbon credits, so that we have funds to give to these communities and say, look, here's a more sustainable way of livelihood compared to cutting the trees, and enabling them to see, by protecting the tree, they have a better livelihood. And it's the carbon credit markets that allows us to do this, and allows other developers to do this, which I think is a great mechanism, which would ensure that moving forward, more and more of these forests will be kind of protected, and prevent them from getting destroyed.
I'm glad you brought up carbon credits, because that was where I was going next. Question I had, and it's popped up in a couple of places from the audience, and I'll try to ask this broadly to hit on all the different aspects of that question being asked. Essentially, just if you could elaborate more on how Blue Forest, plans to essentially generate and utilize carbon credits from these reforestation programs in terms of funding. How do you verify your blue carbon credits? Methodology, a little bit more technical on that side. If you could just elaborate a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. Look, it's not a walk in the park, to be honest with you. It's not like you could kind of send an email to someone with some photos and get some credits and then become rich. This is completely opposite. I'm happy to say that today there exists a relatively sophisticated market structure that really keeps all parties honest, and that it puts the verification and the validations in place to ensure that the work that's being done by developers such as ourselves at Blue Forest is in line with best in class standards, that supports local communities, that really adopts sound planting methodologies, and that has a long-term plan in place. if you think of kind of the conventional route, you'd have to really, look at philanthropists, billionaires. I say, you know what, here's a bit of cash to plant some trees, and then take philanthropy money to plant trees. And then look, we've certainly seen that. And as with everything, there's good philanthropy investments and less good philanthropy investments, where some of the times they give you a certain amount of capital or funding to plant a number of trees, but then the kind of the supervision and the long-term monitoring is not in place, right? Because we have a goal of say that we want to say that we've funded 100 million trees being planted, right? So here's the money to plant the trees, but they're less interested in seeing the survival of the trees over 5, 10, 15 years. With the carbon credit markets, it's completely opposite, because you only get credits if the biomass stays in the trees year after year. And because it's audited and very consistently, if the trees disappear, your credits disappear, right? And so it's very, very simple and very kind of well structured to ensure that the developers do a project that's very, very professional. Now, of course, it's not perfect. There's room for improvement. We work with kind of accreditation platform called Vera, which uses VCS and CCB, which basically just the carbon stock calculation formula. It's a mathematical formula. Just to understand the formula, it's a 50-page document to understand and implement the formula to determine how many carbon credits you get. And so we had to hire a scientist, a PhD, to help us decipher the formula and to implement it as per the accreditation standards, because it's so scientific and it's so methodical. And so I'm bullish on the voluntary carbon markets, and I think they are the best way to channel funds from the polluters to the protectors.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, because part of one of the questions, which I think you touched on, is this idea of, well, as climate change continues to ravage, right, ecology and biodiversity, as your reforestation efforts increase, how do you keep track of the health of the mangrove forest to be able to continue to essentially provide a carbon sink as the impact of climate change occurs? It sounds like, as you said, there's a audit system essentially that keeps in check or keeps track of how the forest health is essentially persisting in terms of size and viability. Speaking of that, if I could pivot to, and this was also a mix of a couple of questions, which is, how do you keep track of the physical aspect? And you mentioned essentially remote sensing. And if you could just add a little bit more on that side in terms of the monitoring aspect, after you've planted the mangroves, and to sort of keep track of how the forest is doing health-wise, size-wise, etc. And how often, you mentioned remote sensing, I heard drones, what's the frequency of monitoring, essentially, to just keep track of the physical health aspect, but also keep track of, for the carbon, for the I guess the reporting, monitoring for the carbon credit side.
Yeah. So look, the drone imagery is very important up front, because it enables you to really diagnose the forest and to understand where are the areas of stress and how best to address those areas, and to understand what species there are and what the planting methodology should be, and to really make sure that you have a good implementation plan. And most developers don't use LiDAR and certainly don't use drone technologies, but we do, because we like to do things in a precise way, in a surgical way. Because if you do it well at the beginning, then you're going to have a higher survival rate, and then your project will be more successful. So we invest in technology and in the brain power to do it really well. And because of this, because we have actually done a good job up front, we are able to put in place operations and maintenance programs that does annual audits of the trees by taking soil measurements, by measuring the tree biomass, that then go into the report, which then help you determine the kind of the impact that you're having, both above ground and below ground.
Perfect. So a couple of questions are on, let's just say, ecosystem balance. And a couple of examples here is, since mangroves are, coastline, vegetation type, how do you balance the concern or risk? They necessarily a one-to-one direct impact, but that will occur. But the first example is, how do you balance the risk of, say, as you sort of bring back mangrove forest and the coastline? Is there risk of, let's say, over-nutrification that affects other sort of biological systems, coral reefs, or fish populations? Although you did mention it does provide habitat. So just want to clarify that. And then related to that, on the land, so that's sort of on the sea, but on the land, in terms of afforestation efforts, the areas that you are looking at or targeting, is there a risk of maybe displacing native species, or nothing is there?
Yeah. Well, look, as a company, we are not huge supporters of afforestation, and we don't involve ourselves in afforestation for that reason. We focus on reforestation and avoided deforestation. Really, those are the two areas. First, like defense, just like protect the tree from being cut. Like that's the first thing you do, like protection, right? Prevent the tree from getting cut, because that's going to store a lot more carbon and be a much better carbon sink than having to plant a seed sapling and waiting for the sapling to grow over 10, 20 years, right? So we have a defensive game, which is like typically 70% of our environment projects is defensive. Prevent additional forest from getting lost by addressing the sources of stress, which are typically socioeconomic stresses. And so that's the first thing, avoided deforestation. And then the second thing is reforestation. So going in, looking at historical maps, and it goes from like gray, like a green, and then suddenly gray, and then red. And then taking the red and saying, how can we make it green again? So these are the two areas that we look at and what we try to do. And we certainly think that by promoting, kind of healthy forests, what you do is you keep the soil stronger, right? And you prevent sedimentation, which then enables the marine life from actually thriving and the coral system to thrive, because you have fishes, because you have less sedimentation and less soil erosion. You're protecting the biodiversity, which I think is crucial. And I think that if done right, it could really help both the above ground and the below ground ecosystems.
Yeah. There are so many questions, and we're running up on the hour.
Who'd have thought? I bet.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's a very interesting topic, and I think people are very much tuned into this. So I will maybe ask a last question that kind of touches on a number of things, and I think would be a good sort of kind of capping question, which is, from your perspective moving forward, as you continue to expand this operation and mainstream and look towards implementing mangrove reforestation efforts around the world, what do you foresee as your biggest challenge? And you've hinted on a few sort of here and there. Climate change certainly is one, right, that could naturally affect urbanization, the competing interests of, like you said, people need to make a living, and in areas where opportunities don't exist, maybe that's an easy way to do it. Is there some other type of factor that poses a challenge? So to you, from your perspective, what do you foresee as your sort of biggest challenges as you continue to expand this effort globally?
Yeah, good question. I think ultimately the problem is us, the humans. I think we're the problem here, and that's my biggest challenge, because the work that we do at Blue Forest really involves about changing habits, right? Basically teaching people that, look, it's not cool to cut trees to make charcoal. It's not cool to cut the trees to sell them for construction material, because that tree is more valuable to you in the ground. And to make them understand this over the long term, so that even once you've left, they still don't cut the tree, right? And to put in place sustainable programs that enhance their livelihoods and also complement the forest. These are always unique to the community and unique to the country. It's not like a formula that you could adopt and then replicate around the world, particularly since we work in very unique countries, like anywhere from like Indonesia to Gabon. I mean, they're very different type of environments, habits, tribal histories, and you really have to develop, for each country its own bespoke set of solutions that are designed to kind of make the communities understand that they have more to gain by protecting the forest than they do by looking to the forest for their livelihood needs. And doing this is a long-term exercise that's not easy. It involves a lot of work. It's a big challenge. But look, to have an impact requires hard work. We've signed up for this. This is what we do, and we're taking on the challenge head on.
Perfect. As maybe another way to say it, no risk, no reward.
Yeah, or what I say is nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Absolutely, absolutely. Vahid, thank you so much. I guess maybe a clarifying point to make on some comments made is that asking about links to some of the resources and connectivity, and we'll make sure to include that in the posting of this event on MEI's website as well. So we'll make sure to do that. Again,
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Apologies to everyone, couldn't get to all the questions, but maybe there's a way folks can engage with you. You left your contact information at the end of your slides. And I think there are also questions on people interested on how can they participate? How can they join the movement, so to speak?
Yeah, definitely. We need help. I mean, we need help. You have my email. There's lots of projects in different hemispheres that we're working on. And we need talent from everywhere, from communication, technology, legal, scientific. So depending on the person's skills and location, I'm sure we could find a way to get them involved.
Perfect. All right. We'll make sure to include, that type of contact information so people can follow up if they choose to. Thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending live. As I mentioned, this is our first of our new series on innovations and climate resilience, and what a way to start with a bang on this particular topic in Earth Day. So thank you all, and stay tuned for upcoming events on this particular series. Enjoy Earth Day, everyone. Take care.